Now that we're familiar at a high level with how exactly we should structure our financial models, let's take an in-depth review with an example financial model to see how I structured it, and let's also study the most important tab, the Drivers tab. Go ahead and open up this file, 6.02 Example Financial Model. In the first tab, we have an Instructions tab, which clearly lays out what each tab does, and the color scheme, which we'll talk about in a video shortly. We then have a Summary tab, which allows us to aggregate our profit and loss, our balance sheet, and our statement of cash flows on an annual, quarterly, and monthly basis. We then have a full detailed profit and loss showing where the company has been, as well as where exactly the company is going. The same thing for our balance sheet, where we have our historicals and our projections, and the same thing for our cash flows. Before I go over the Drivers tab, let's just take a look at the other tabs here. Here we have an error check, which we'll cover shortly for best practices and how exactly to set that up. And then I have a List tab, which is helpful for me to utilize for the data validation in our model, and this PBC table, which stands for Prepared by Client. If you ever worked at Big Four, you'd understand what PBC stands for. This is my source information. Now, I unpivoted this information using our tool, Model Wiz, and later on in our course, I'll show you how you can generate source information without unpivoting that data. But this has our source profit and loss, our source balance sheet, and our account list as such. So I'm gonna just hide these two tabs because I really don't need them. And let's now focus on the structure of our Drivers tab. So the idea is that I want to consolidate as many of the assumptions as possible on this Drivers tab so that all a user needs to do is come in and edit this tab in order to control their projections. So let's just study the formula of how exactly I have this set up. You'll notice that I have the actuals shown historically from January 2023 through December 2024. And then we have projections starting in January 2025. So if I go to my income statement, you'll notice that this information is simply just pulling directly from that Drivers tab. So it has one consistent formula, and the same thing is true for my balance sheet and cash flows. The only tab with inconsistent formulas for historicals and projections is the Drivers tab, because I'm pulling in historical information from that table that I showed you earlier with our source data, and then I'm entering in all of my projections over here. I could also expand column D in order to see the driver for each and every single profit and loss account. Now, I kept this very simple. I simply just took an average of everything for the last 6 months with a 5% buffer over here. I then did the same thing for the balance sheet, only I made that equal to the prior month. As we remember earlier, if the balance sheet stays stagnant, there will be no cash flow impact other than what's shown on the profit and loss. I also included this information for my cash flows, but because this isn't really an input, this isn't really so important to showcase on the Drivers tab, but the way that our app is set up, it allows us to just quickly pull that information into this Summary tab as such. Now, notice what I also have over here. If it's a historical month, which I call last month of actuals via a name range, it'll return the name actual. Otherwise, it'll return the name projection. Now, this Drivers tab may be called something else in another model. For instance, it could be called model, or it can be called assumption. The key thing is that you want to make it really easy for the readers of your financial model to understand where they can go to make the majority of all of their updates. Now, like we spoke about earlier, you may also have a different tab like headcount or revenue. That information would be difficult to include only in this tab here in the Drivers tab. The reason being, you have a lot of additional schedules. But going back to our diagram over here, as you can see, even if we have additional tabs with information, they should all still roll up into the Drivers tab, which will then roll up into the detailed financial statements, and then finally get us to our dashboards. As you advance in your financial modeling journey, you can replace where it says these drivers with just a 6-month driver to instead reference the actual tab that it'll be pulled from when you build out your headcount build, your revenue build, your CapEx build, or really anything else. But I like to still consolidate and bring all the information into this tab so that once again, my structure just needs to pay attention to the values in this tab in order to get all of my outputs. And now that we're familiar with the Drivers tab and our financial modeling structure, let's do a deep dive on how to set up proper error checks.